Hello and welcome to what episode is this? Episode 97 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Pannobhasa. And for the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been having like this weird virusy kind of stuff going on with like head pressure and like mucus and stuff. And I'm not exactly sure what the cause of it is. I suspect has something to do with the fact that the weather is getting really hot here in South Carolina, and also the air is occasionally thick with pollen. So there's not necessarily even a virus involved. But such is life. It's just the way it goes. And the show must go on. So I'm going for it. And the first question is from Neil. And this question was not asked under a Q&A. It was asked recently under one of my videos where I'm reading very ancient Buddhist poetry, like early Pali texts. And so Neil says, simple question about something that comes up regularly in discussions of Buddhism and seems to be happening here. Pannobhasa is reading this poetry, particularly the sections about the supreme man, but instead of presenting it as a description of the goal, he seems to present it as a description of the attitude one should take to get enlightened. This is much like the common teaching that trying to be without desires is a path rather than desirelessness being a description of the goal. Why? Why should I think that attempting to function in terms of my ignorant understanding of enlightenment should be the way to get there? Well, I mean, with regard to how I am presenting it, I'm just reading the text. So it's not like I'm trying to put some kind of spin on it, like this is how you become enlightened, rather than this is what an enlightened being is like. And there's not necessarily a real difference there. When I was in Burma, sometimes I would encounter Buddhists who were behaving in very unenlightened ways. And if it was like a monk or like a wise, serious student of Buddhism, I might point this out to them. And often you'd get the answer that, well, our behavior won't be perfect until we're enlightened. And so in Burma, and probably outside of Burma too, a lot of Buddhists think that somehow you're just going to continue behaving in an unenlightened way until you become enlightened, and then all of a sudden, click, all of a sudden your behavior is going to become perfect. And I really don't think it works that way. That in order to become enlightened to some degree, you have to imitate the behavior, mental and physical, of an enlightened being. Sort of like fake it till you make it, in a way. Although, I mean, just really faking it where you're pretending to be enlightened, trying to pass yourself off as enlightened, then yeah, that is forbidden. You're not supposed to do that. But still, it's like the wise person, like an enlightened being, he wouldn't tell lies. So, if you're not enlightened, but you would like to become enlightened, then it would behove you not to tell lies. Same goes with like drunken partying and so forth. Screaming obscenities on street corners, that sort of thing. So, in a way, the path to enlightenment involves sort of gradually trying to perfect your behavior, perfect your conduct, and also perfect your mental states. At least that is the ancient Indian way. That's the way the early Buddhists were doing it. So when it's talking about what the supreme man is like, what an enlightened being is like, then if you want to be like that enlightened being, then you should try to live the way that enlightened being allegedly lives. So there's really not that much difference between explaining what an enlightened being is like and what a person striving to become enlightened is like. Because the person striving to become enlightened is striving to be as much like an enlightened being as possible until there's no difference. So that would be my answer to this, I suppose. Although there's another kind of question here towards the end where he's saying this is much like the common teaching that trying to be without desires is a path rather than desirelessness being a description of the goal. Well, the practice is you have fewer and fewer desires. I mean, that's what Dhamma is about. You know, in order for it to be really Dhammic or Dharmic, there has to be an emphasis on having fewer desires. So you just have fewer and fewer desires until you don't have any anymore. It's not like you're just going to be chock full of desires and then all of a sudden you're going to have liberating insight. There's going to be this click and all of a sudden you don't have any. It doesn't work that way, really. But it is true that if you desire not to have desires, then that's still a desire. So you just practice having fewer desires just as a matter of sacred duty, or it's just that's what you dedicate your life towards. Just it seems like the best thing you can dedicate your life towards. But still, if you have a desire for enlightenment, then I've described this before. This is often how it works, at least according to some of the literature, where you abandon all of your other worldly desires and you just have this one big desire for enlightenment that is motivating you, that's getting you through life until finally you get to this point where you can't get enlightened because you still have this one attachment left. You still have this one desire left. And then when you fully realize that, then the liberating insight allows that one last desire to drop away. So, describing what an enlightened being is like and describing, what a person striving to become an enlightened being is like, it's really not that different unless you're talking about, just miraculous psychic powers or something. But with regard to just conduct and like not being angry, not being like greedy, that sort of thing, then there's really not that much difference. And the better you are, the better you get at it, of not being greedy and angry and so forth, the closer to enlightenment you are, as a general rule. I think cows are not very greedy or angry, but still, I don't think that in a way, they're close to enlightenment, but the enlightenment is in the wrong direction. They got to go this way, and the enlightenment is like right behind them, so to speak. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Wayne. And Wayne says, excuse me, people who report near-death experiences usually talk about communicating with their past loved ones and sometimes other angelic beings and so on. It would seem to me there would be a general sharing and communication happening in all the different realms of existence. What about Nibbana? Do you think enlightened beings are also able to communicate with other enlightened beings? I know this is off the scale and wouldn't be found in the suttas. Just would like to hear your thoughts. Well, let's see, where does it say up here? Oh yeah, in all the different realms of existence, but Nibbana is really not a realm of existence. It's so off the scale, it's not a realm. It's not like heaven or anything like that. With regard to near-death experiences where people are communicating with their loved ones and other angelic beings, spiritual guides, and so on, that is very culturally conditioned. It depends a lot upon their expectations. And like the Tibetan Book of the Dead tells you, just reminds you that you're supposed to remind yourself when you're in these experiences that this is mind-made, that this is essentially a figment of imagination in the Bardo realm. So, you'll see what you expect to see, and it may be that your own deep spirit or subconscious mind is generating this entire scenario. So it may be that you're really not communicating with other beings so much as you're communicating with deeper levels of your own psyche, sort of like a channeler does, where just assuming that channelers aren't really channeling the Archangel Metatron or Moses or whatever, that they're really just channeling information that is in their subconscious mind that they can't really access without some sort of gimmick. They can't believe that they can just access it freely, and so they come up with this gimmick like tarot cards or like some being that they're supposedly channeling in a trance or some such. So I think I've lost the thread of this question, however. Just sort of like quibbling on something that said toward the beginning. Oh, so Nibbana, I mean, some two beings enter Nibbana, they're no longer two separate beings, really. And they don't need to communicate because both of them already have access to essentially omniscience. There's no need to communicate with any other being, assuming that there would be individual beings in Nibbana, which technically speaking, there are not. So if you're already omniscient, you're no longer like thinking in words. You just have, in a way, access to like infinite consciousness. There's no real need to communicate unless you're like still in a meat body trying to help unenlightened beings. So that would be my answer to that one, I guess. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Mooners. And Mooners says, are you familiar with the Maha Yazawin? And I mean, that Yazawin is a Burmese word. It's like the Burmese version of the Pali or Sanskrit Rajawamsa, the lineage of kings. And it's the Burmese word for like chronicle. So the Maha Yazawin would be the great lineage of kings or the great chronicle. And the only real Burmese Yazawin that I'm aware of is the Manan Yazawin, or the Glass Palace Chronicle, which is sort of like the official early Pali chronicle of the early history of Burma. So it may be that what Mooners is calling the Maha Yazawin is the same as the Manan Yazawin. So it discusses like a lot of mythological, legendary stuff way back, and then it gets gradually more historical, like more objective, empirical history, as you get farther forwards, farther closer to modern times. But I assume it must be Burmese because I don't know if any other language would have the word Yazawin. And it was mainly like an imitation of the Mahawamsa. No, is that right? The Mahawamsa? Yeah, the main Sinhalese chronicle. So I haven't read the Manan Yazawin or the Glass Palace Chronicle other than excerpts, mainly with regard to the Buddhist sect that the Burmese mainly followed before they converted to Theravada, which was the Maha'ari sect. So I've read probably most of the extracts or the quotes about the Maha'ari extracted from the Manan Yazawin or the Glass Palace Chronicle. But also I've read certain other extracts from the Glass Palace Chronicle, like early Burmese kings who worshipped cobras and so forth, or nagas, cobra dragons. But yeah, so I mean, I'm that familiar with it where I've read extensive extracts from it. I know what it is, assuming that the Glass Palace Chronicle is the same as the Great Chronicle that Mooners is mentioning here. But I don't know what other chronicle it would be. But I haven't, so I'm vaguely familiar with it, but I haven't read the whole thing. I do believe there is a translation that was made by scholars during British colonial times. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, I've been reading your books and the chapter on ancient Indian star calendar. Fascinating stuff. I was wondering if you and Brian will discuss this in future. Brian. This is Brian Ruhe. And I've said pretty much everything I had to say in the book. Essays in Theravada Buddhism. So, there wouldn't be any new information that I could come up with other than maybe a few details of just the history of me writing it, like how I found the book that had most of the relevant information in it and so forth. Found that in like a used bookstall in Rangoon. Let's see. Yeah, and Brian, he wouldn't really be able to contribute. It's better if Brian and I do a video that it's something that both of us have something to say about, that both of us can contribute to this. And I don't think Brian would really know that much about ancient or early medieval Indian astronomy, for example. But if you do want to know about the ancient Buddhist calendar, like the calendar that the North Indians were using in the Buddhist time and in subsequent centuries with modifications, then yeah, my first book, Studies or Essays in Theravada Buddhism, does have a rather detailed description of it. And I wrote that largely because I could not find that information, that there's an obscure rule of monastic discipline saying that if a monk is going to be living in a forest, he has to be able to use the night sky as a calendar. And I looked for the information, just could not find it. Till finally, it's in the editorial notes of an old edition of the Surya Siddhanta that was translated by Ebenezer Burgess, who was a British or an English Christian missionary in Burma, or in India, I should say. So, yeah, if you really want to know the information, that would be the best. Just reading that essay contains most of the information that I could provide on the subject. And the only extra information I could provide would just be personal details about how I was, trying to gather the information and so forth. And I don't think Brian would have much to say at all, other than that's interesting, that kind of thing. So, yeah, probably when Brian and I do videos in future, and I still have 2 in the can with Brian that I haven't even uploaded yet because last couple of weeks, it's like I've been saying, the weather is like really hot. I'm working in a shop that is not climate controlled, so it's like I'm working in blazing heat all day, and then I come home and just crash like a wet rag or something. Just relax, and I just don't even think about it. I'm thinking about other things instead, I guess. So, with all due respects to Athena's Sigil, I really don't think that Brian and I are going to be doing any videos on the ancient Indian star calendar anytime in the foreseeable future. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Indiana Dhamma. And Indiana Dhamma says, when you were in Burma, did you ever encounter someone, whether a monk or a layperson, that you suspected could have been an Arahant? Well, I met a number of monks that were considered to be Arahants. In fact, in some parts of Burma, I was considered to be an Arahant. You really don't have to be all that outstanding to be considered an Arahant. All you have to do really is live alone in like a forest or a cemetery or someplace that the average Burmese person wouldn't want to live. Follow the rules relatively strictly, mind your own business, actually meditate, and you'll be so outstanding just from doing that you'll get a reputation for being an Arahant. I had a friend of mine who was considered to be an Arahant also. There was one person just swearing up and down that he saw him like levitating through the sky. Another person was telling me that they had seen a picture of me levitating in the sky, but it was probably somebody else because I do not recall having done that. So, there was this one, I think he was called Bodhi Ain Doya Sayadaw, who was considered to be an Arahant, and I was taken to go see him by one of his devotees. And on the way there, I asked the devotee, "Are you sure that he's an Arahant?" And yep, I'm sure. How could he possibly know? I don't know. And when I got to this place, it was like a circus. There were just like pagodas and shrines and statues and stuff being built everywhere. There's just crowds of people all waiting to see the monk who is considered to be an Arahant. And he comes out to eat his lunch at about 11:45. And one of the first things he does after he sits down is he blows his nose into his hand and then just wipes it on the wall behind him. And then he sits there and eats until like 12:30, which is against the rules. And how they considered that he was enlightened or not, I don't know. He didn't really strike me as particularly outstanding. But I did meet one monk. I mean, if I had to guess, who was the most spiritually advanced person I met in Burma? My guess, the person that comes into mind would be Shwe Umin Seattle, who was the founder of Shwe Umin Doya. He was the teacher of the much more famous U Tejaniya, or at least he was much more famous 10, 15, 20 years ago. Although the Burmese really don't have a high opinion of the disciple U Tejaniya, who's the abbot of Shwe Umin Doya now. But Shwe Umin Seattle, I met him once, and I met a monk who was a retired surgeon. He ordained as a monk after he retired, and he had just traveled Burma looking for saints and sages. And the one monk that impressed him the most, the one that he considered was the most likely to be fully enlightened, was Webu Seattle. Although Webu Seattle died back in the 1970s, I think. I never met him. I never met Tongpulu Seattle either, who was the founder of my tradition. So, but this retired surgeon who was ordained as a monk said that of the monks that were alive then, the one that impressed him the most was this same Shwe Umin Seattle. And Shwe Umin Seattle was a disciple of Mahasi Seattle. And Mahasi Seattle, according to what I've been told, wanted Shwe Umin Seattle to be his successor in the Mahasi tradition, like the new leader of the Mahasi tradition. After Mahasi Seattle passed away, Shwe Umin Seattle just rejected that and just went his own way. And he did have a better meditation method, in my opinion. But yeah, I met him once in Mon State, and I walked to where he was, and I was just drenched in sweat. My robes were just drenched in sweat. And Shwe Umin Seattle was there with another old monk. They're approximately the same age, I would guess. And the other monk that was with Shwe Umin Seattle, I mean, he was like senile. I mean, he was in an advanced state of deterioration. And if anyone spoke to him, they would yell into his ear, and still they couldn't be sure if he really understood what was going on around him. But Shwe Umin Seattle, he had to have been, in his 80s at least when I met him. He was just sitting straight up and down, just bright eyes, just looking right at you intently. It's just, there's no way you could know for sure if he was enlightened or not, assuming that even means anything in some sort of context. But he was very alert, very just like, I don't know how to explain it. You just sort of feel the vibe of another person, so to speak. And he seemed very with it. Of all the monks that I've met that had a reputation for spiritual advancement, he was the one that really, those rumors or beliefs about the spiritual advancement, I could take it fairly seriously with regard to him. He seems to have been relatively spiritually advanced, although how spiritually advanced, I really can't say. So I guess I should just move on to the next question. These questions are from Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana. And Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana is going through a kind of phase where he'll just post a link and ask me to comment on the video or the essay or whatever it is. So his first question or request is, please do a Dhamma analysis of this video. And it's some short on YouTube by someone who calls himself Vsauce. And Vsauce is this guy standing in a swimming pool, and he's talking about the state of nothing, or the word nothing, really. So he says, he posits this statement, nothing is better than eternal happiness. And then he posits the statement, a sandwich is better than nothing. So therefore, a sandwich is better than eternal happiness. But this is just like a grammatical trick. It's like the term nothing in a sentence can have different meanings. And Vsauce discusses this also. So there's really not much of a Dhamma analysis. It's more of a grammatical or semantic analysis over the use of nothing in English sentences. So Yeah, I mean, nothing has two different meanings. When you say nothing is better than eternal happiness, that, I mean, you're not stating that vacuum is better than eternal happiness. You know, that void, emptiness is better than eternal happiness. That's not really the meaning. I mean, some people might interpret it that way, but that's really not the meaning. That, I mean, eternal happiness is the best, supposedly. And then the sandwich is better than nothing just means the sandwich is better than not having anything to eat. And Vsauce discusses this, and it's really not a Dhamma issue so much as just a grammar and semantics issue over different ways of using the word nothing in an English sentence. So, let's see here. Nothing's better than eternal happiness. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just two different ways of using the same word. And Vsauce discusses this, and it's not really a Dhamma issue. I mean, the first example sentence, nothing is better than eternal happiness, then I guess you could say that is dharmic, but that's about the only dharma in the whole video as far as I can tell. So I don't think that Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana would want me to discuss whether or not nothing is better than eternal happiness, because Nirvana is called a kind of eternal happiness, but it's not really an emotional state. It's just called eternal happiness just because it's like the best possible goal, I guess. In a way, I mean, sometimes Nibbana or enlightenment is called the greatest happiness, but it's essentially just the cessation of dukkha. The end of dukkha is the greatest happiness. So, I mean, some people would even interpret that to be just emptiness or void. So emptiness or void would be the same as eternal happiness in that case. So I think I'm just going to move on to Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana's next question, which also is sort of requesting a commentary on this YouTube short by this same guy called Vsauce, who in this case is not standing in a swimming pool. And Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana says, which one do you choose? Sounds like samsara versus nibbana. And this Vsauce guy, he has two scenarios. One scenario is you've got an infinite number of beings in just like bliss. You know, it's like a heaven realm. You've got an infinite number of beings in this advanced heaven realm. And then like periodically, I can't remember how often it is, periodically, maybe one a year, it doesn't really matter, that they go from this realm of bliss to a realm of misery, eternal misery, that once you go to the realm of misery, it just stays that way. So you start off, an infinite number of beings start off in heaven, and then gradually, one by one, they're going to hell. Excuse me. And then the other scenario is the opposite, where you've got an infinite number of beings in essentially a hell realm, and then one by one, periodically, they go into a heaven realm. And he's saying which one is preferable. And I mean, if it's eternal, I mean, like in Buddhism with no beginning and no end, then it seems to me that they'd be essentially the same. I mean, you're never going to run out of the infinite beings in the first realm because you got an infinite number. You can just subtract one. You can just keep subtracting one every second, every year. It doesn't matter. There's still always going to be an infinite number in the first realm. And then the second realm, since it's been going on forever, there's going to be an infinite number in the second realm too. So it's just going to be an infinite number in heaven and an infinite number of hell, regardless of which way you go. I mean, personally, I would prefer going from hell to heaven rather than going from heaven to hell. And I mean, if there is a beginning to this whole thing, you'd probably be better off in hell for a finite period of time and then wind up in heaven for an infinite period of time. But I mean, winning the lotto, I mean, it doesn't really make sense. And this is part of the problem, is that when you try to deal with infinity intellectually, it's just going to break down into paradox and nonsense. There's ways of proving this geometrically and so forth that I'm not gonna get into that. But the human intellect cannot deal with infinity. I mean, there's ways you can sort of have a limited infinity that you can use in mathematical equations or problems or something. But the human mind just cannot grasp it. It's just turning infinity into a concept that can be used in certain ways. So, yeah, I mean, if it's infinite into the past and infinite into the future, I don't think it really matters. But, because you're just going to have infinite number of beings in heaven and in hell, regardless of what happens. But, I mean, if it does have a beginning, then you're better off starting in hell and then going to heaven, although it may take an infinitely long time for you to be the one person out of an infinite number that gets to go to heaven. But, I mean, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, you can't really envision what would be the percentage, for example, of the beings in heaven and the beings in hell. I mean, there's no way you could calculate that. You could just draw the line anywhere. It'd just be arbitrary. So I guess I answered that. I mean, just for this, unfortunately I don't have to choose this, but I assume starting off in hell and then going to heaven would be preferable. But you start off with an infinite number and only one each time gets to go to the other realm, then the assumption is that, I mean, you may be in hell for a heck of a long time. A hell of a long time, if you will, before you get into heaven. But, I mean, the intellect cannot deal with this kind of stuff. And I guess I've already answered the question. So I'm just going to move on to Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana's next question here. And this is a quote from the Samyutta Nikaya. So it's Samyutta Nikaya 1235. And it says, if there is the view, the soul and the body are the same, there is no living of the holy life. And if there is the view, the soul is one thing, the body is another, there is no living of the holy life. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma by the middle, with birth as condition, aging and death, etc. So first of all, I would say that the term soul is probably not the best possible translation here. I'm pretty sure the original Pali word is jiva, which means life. So it's like the life force and the body are the same, or the life force is one thing and the body is another. That might be closer to the soul, although different beliefs, like in Jainism, what comes closest to the idea of a soul is also called the jiva, or essentially like the life force, the life of the body. So anyways, this sutta is saying that if your vital principle and your body are the same, there's no point in living the holy life. There's no point, you can't become enlightened. On the other hand, if your vital principle is one thing and your body is another, again, you can't become enlightened. There's no point in living the holy life. And I would point out that, as I've pointed out before, that in the Buddhist time and the few centuries after the Buddhist time, there really was no formal logic established in India. It may be that formal logic entered the India through trade routes with Europe when Aristotle finally got imported into India, or Aristotelian ideas anyway. And so just because it says this, it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a valid logical explanation for it. But if we assume that there is a valid logical explanation for the statements in this sutta, if the body and the vital principle are the same, then when you die, that's it. You're dead. Your vital principle is also dead. So what's the point of striving for enlightenment when, you're just going to poof out of existence at the moment of death anyway? On the other hand, if the soul is one thing and the body is another, it may be, assuming that there's a valid logical reason for this statement, then you could say that, well, whatever your body does, it's not going to have any effect at all on your soul or your jiva, your vital principle, whatever. So because they're separate, they're two different things. So you can manipulate the body. You can do all this body stuff, like spiritual practices and so forth. It's not going to have any effect on your soul. So there's no point in practicing Dhamma in that respect either. So then you go into the paradoxical middle path between is and isn't, same and different, which is dependent co-arising, paticca samuppada, which is in some suttas considered to be the very heart of Buddhism, even though almost nobody understands it. So let's see. The question, I didn't even get to the question. The question is, can you explain why there is no holy life if the body and soul are the same, and no holy life if they are different? Yeah, I already answered that. I hope I answered it. So if I didn't, well, then that's just tough, because I gave it a shot, and I'm moving on to the next question now. And this is from Mr. Special Victory, which in Burmese would be U Aung San, who was the father of modern Burma. The George Washington of modern Burma, if you will. And Mr. Special Victory says, is the exchanging of small bows between monks or between a monk and layperson common in Southeast Asia? Would it be offensive if a bow was offered by one but not returned by the other? A friend of mine has a story about meeting a Theravada monk in the US and greeting him with a small bow. He felt aggrieved when the monk didn't bow in return or respond in any way. Well, I'll start off with what Vinaya says, the rules of monastic discipline. A junior monk is required to pay respects to a senior monk. A senior monk is forbidden to pay respects to a junior monk. And also he is the only being that a monk is allowed to pay respects to, which would include making anjali, or gasho as it's called in Zen, where you join your palms like this. You don't even have to bow, although bowing is included. But even just joining your hands together is a sign of respect to another person. The only person that a monk is allowed to do that to is a senior monk, a monk that is senior to him. So it's against the rules of monastic discipline for a monk to pay respects to a junior monk, to pay respects to a lay person, clearly to pay respects to the member of a different religion, even to pay respects to a god, like a small g god, or deva, small d deva. That is, it'd be breaking a rule, and you're not allowed to do it. However, in Thailand, there's a lot of emphasis on just politeness, and it's like Thai culture that, you kind of pay respects to each other. And so some senior Thai monks will make anjali or bow their, kind of nod at least to not only a junior monk, but to lay people also, even though they're breaking a rule by doing it. So the Thais, due to traditional politeness etiquette, will break the rules sometimes in this regard. But like Burmese monks, as a general rule, they don't pay respects to lay people or even junior monks, really. Sometimes if monks are about equal, out of respect for each other, they'll pay respect to each other. If they've got like the same number of wasa, or the same number of rainy seasons under their belt as monks. That's how you count your seniority as a monk, is by how many rains retreats you have spent as a monk. So it's one rain per year. In fact, the word for year in Pali is wasa, which means rain. At least that's a word for year. So it's sort of like in the old cowboy movies where the Indians are talking about many moons. It's one moon per month. It was kind of similar in ancient India, where it's one rain per year. One rainy season, that is. So I guess I answered that. So I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, in Mahayana Buddhism, compassion and wisdom are very important parts of one's development towards liberation. And I'm just checking to make sure we're recording here. I gotta do that. I've screwed myself too many times by thinking that it was recording and it wasn't. Okay, so Cleefy says, in Mahayana Buddhism, compassion and wisdom are very important parts of one's development towards liberation. I understand the compassion part, but what exactly do they mean when they talk about the wisdom? And I think that would depend upon what school of Mahayana Buddhism, possibly even what author of the text, who is the author of the text, that I do not think that they would all agree on exactly what wisdom would be. Like in the Perfection of Wisdom literature, Prajna Paramita, that it would be a kind of paradoxical sort of cutting through the intellect and just seeing clearly. And that would be sort of like the Zen definition of wisdom too. Whereas in something like Pure Land or some other school of Buddhism, of Mahayana Buddhism, it might be something very different. It might be something more just like, seeing the Four Noble Truths and so forth, as is often emphasized in Theravada. So I do think that at least in the Mahayana texts that I like the best, that wisdom is like seeing through samsara, just cutting through perception and intellect and just getting closer and closer to ultimate truth, which is beyond words. Although for a beginner, just the idea of I don't know, it would be a step in that direction. For a beginner, just sort of realizing that you don't get it yet. I mean, that would be a kind of wisdom. Like one of my favorite verses of the Dhammapada, I think it's, verse number 63? Don't quote me on that. Where it says, the fool who is aware of his foolishness is at least wise to that extent. But the fool who considers himself wise is called a fool indeed. So if you know that you're a fool, that means you're at least a little bit wise. And that was one of my great comforting thoughts as a junior monk. So let's see here. I guess I answered that in a kind of a brief way. I'm being unusually brief, unusually concise in this video, because usually I'm just like wandering all over the place. So anyways, the next question is from Mary J. And Mary J says, please give the formula for making confession in Pali and English. And this is almost a trick question. I'll tell you what it says in the Pali text, and I've pretty much memorized it, but I have it written down in this notebook that I had as a monk. So this is how you make confession according to the Vinaya itself, according to the rules of monastic discipline. The first monk says, the monk who is making confession, and he's making confession to a junior monk here. He says, Aham awuso etanamam apatem apano dampati desemi, which means, friend, I have committed an offense of such and such name. I hereby confess it. And then the second monk that is receiving the confession says, pasasi, which means, do you see it? And then the first monk says, ama pasami, which means, yes, I see it. And then the second monk says, ayatem samarayasi, which means, in the future, you should restrain yourself. And that's it. That's the whole confession. And part of the problem, why I've never heard any actual Theravada monks actually following this and making confession according to what it says you're supposed to say in the texts, is this troublesome term etanamam. So aham awuso etanamam apatem apano means, friend, I have committed an offense of such and such name. So that etanamam means such and such name. An offense of such a name, which means you have to specify what offense you broke. And most monks nowadays don't speak Pali well enough to be able to explain what offense they committed in Pali. And the way I used to do it, because I was trying to be very strict when I was in Burma, is I would explain what offenses I committed in Burmese to the monk I was making confession to, and then I would just go through the Pali formula. And in Thailand, they have this weird way of, they break it down by category. like, I don't know if I don't think they would make confession for parajika, because you just can't confess parajika. You're excommunicated, you're out. But every category below parajika, like Sangadi Sesa, and then let's see, it'd be Tulachaya, and then Nesagiya Pachitya, Patidesaniya, Dukkada, and Dubasita. I think that's all of them, if I remember correctly. That they would just say, I've committed several of these, and then several of these, and then several of these, and then several of these. And that's not right either, because the next thing is, the monk who is receiving the confession says, Pasasi, do you see them? And then the monk says, yes, I see them, when actually they may not see anything. They're just giving the whole list of every possible offense that could be committed, just in case. They want to make sure that it's all confessed, but they're confessing stuff that they haven't. Like a Patidesaniya offense, almost nobody breaks a Patidesaniya offense anymore, because they're pretty much obsolete. And so, in a way, they're lying when they make confession that way. And in Burma, it's, let's see, it'd be aham awuso. Let's see. Man, it's been a long time since I made confession to a Burmese monk. See, aham bante sabha apatiyo oikromi. That's the first thing that we would say. I'll do it to bante. I'll do it to a senior monk. So aham bante sabha apatiyo oikromi, which means, Venerable Sir, I confess all my offenses. And then the second monk says, sadhu awuso sadhu, which means, very good friend, very good, very good. And then the monk making confession says, ahambande, let's see, sambahulan nana wotuka sabha apatiyo awikaromi. Awikaromi, which means, Venerable Sir, I committed many offenses of various types. And that's as specific as they get. There's no etanamam, there's no offense of such and such name. They don't bother with that. They just say, I committed many offenses of such of various types, and then that's it. And then the other monk says, Pasasi awuso ta apatiyo, which, friend, do you see those offenses? And then the monk who's making confession says, Ama bante pasami, which means, yes, sir, I see them. And then the monk receiving the confession says, Ayatem awuso samarya si, and then which is, in the future you should restrain yourself. And then they add this unnecessary and usually dishonest line at the end, which is sadhu sotu bante samare sami, which is, very good, let it be so, Venerable Sir, I will restrain myself. When, in all likelihood, they're just going to keep breaking the same rules over and over again, just habitually, without bothering to try to not break the rules anymore. So, yeah, in my book, Essays in Theravada Buddhism, that I wrote an essay on this very subject, about how, in the text themselves, the rules of monastic discipline say you're supposed to make confession this way. Nobody makes confession that way. And it just turns into this meaningless blah, blah, blah. It's like this magical blah, blah, blah that makes your offenses go away. And it doesn't make your karma go away. I remember one time I met a Burmese monk who, he asked me, don't you ever get hungry in the afternoon? And I say, well, sometimes, but it's not that big of a deal. And then he goes, I get very hungry in the afternoon, so I just eat dinner. But it's okay, I just make confession and the offense goes away. And I told him, like, the karma doesn't go away. In fact, the confession itself is bogus, because part of the confession is you're saying, I will restrain myself in future, when there's no intention of restraining oneself in future. So that's one reason why I've considered that a lot of monks that are considered to be Aryas really aren't Aryas, at least not in the traditional technical sense, because an Arya can't tell a lie. And these monks are just making this bullshit confession where they're kind of sort of almost confessing something and then lying at the end, saying they'll restrain themselves when they have no intention of restraining themselves. But it may be that for them, they're just saying the rote memorized poly blah, blah, blah that makes the offenses go away. They're not even thinking about the meaning, in which case they're not so much lying as just like babbling nonsense. What they're saying has no meaning, which also isn't good. That's kind of wrong speech also. So I guess just as review, I'll just say, Monk A says, Aham awuso itanamam apatem apano dampadi desemi. And then Monk B says, Pasasi. Monk A says, Ama pasami. And then Monk B says, Ayatem samarayasi, which is Monk A says, Friend, I have committed an offense of such and such name. I confess that. Monk B says, do you see it? Monk A says, yes, I see it. And then Monk B says, in the future, you should restrain yourself. And with regard to Thai monks just making a blanket confession of every category of offense, just to make sure they get it all confessed, not only is that against the rules, but there is an extra confession that I've never heard of anybody ever making. But it's in the rules of monastic discipline where you have doubt. You're not sure if you broke a rule. Then there's a special confession where you can't really confess, or it's against the rules to confess an offense that you don't see, to confess an offense that you're not sure about. Like you think maybe you broke a rule, but you're not sure. You know, it's like you drank some fruit juice that had gone off in the hot weather or something. It's like, was this alcoholic or not? You know, you can't be sure. Then there's this other offense that you make where you confess doubt. It's like, I am uncertain. And I don't know if I have this one written down. No, I don't think so. Oh, here we go. Yeah, here's the offense. This is the one where it says, Aham bante etanamaya apatiya we madiko yada nebe madiko boesami tadatam apatim prikresami, which means, Venerable Sir, I am in doubt with regard to an offense of such and such name. When I am no longer in doubt, then I will confess it. And as far as I know, I mean, that's right there in the Pali text. It says that's how you deal with it. I've never heard of any monk ever doing that. I assume there's some very strict monks in very strict monasteries that actually make that kind of confession. But in Burma, nobody's ever heard of it. You know, you try and make that kind of confession, they'll just look at you like you're just an ignorant barbarian that doesn't know how to make confession correctly. Because to make confession correctly, you just do the ritual, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes they'll even start answering before you're even done just to get it over with quicker. Because it's just like this magical blah, blah, blah that makes your offenses go away. So, I don't know if this is going to help Mary J at all, because it's not, I mean, he won't know how to spell it or anything. But if he does have my book on essays in Theravada Buddhism, then it's all there. It's all written down there. In black and white, if you please. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Fred. And Fred says, can we nail the fact spirit is coalesced into a form with a template, for example, dog or cat? What's your thoughts? So, spirit is coalesced into a form. I mean, that's kind of an intriguing way of describing it, really. I usually don't think of it in those terms. But, I mean, you could say that that's kind of correct. Like in, I think it's William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Gosh, I think I've got it in the same book here. Yeah, right here. The Voice of the Devil, right there. Let's see. He's, I mean, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, it was like my Bible when I was like 18 years old. Let's see. So those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained, and the restrainer or reason usurps its place and governs the unwilling. Then being restrained, it by degrees becomes passive till it is only the shadow of desire, which William Blake considered not to be a good thing. But, okay, let's see, where is it? Oh, no, it's... Damn. I know it's in here somewhere. Let's see. Well, I can't find it. It's it's in William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And he's talking about how, I mean, the six senses and this world is like what spirit coalesces into in this version of reality. So I think William Blake might agree with Fred here that spirit is condensed or coalesced into a form with a template. The template, I guess, would be our karma. You know, our karma is sort of determining how our spirit is coalesced into a kind of physical body with sense organs and so forth. It is kind of an unusual way of explaining it, but I mean, it's as valid or invalid as any number of other ways of explaining it. Because I'm really not a materialist, as I keep saying. So I do consider that this world we're living in is really a manifestation of mind or spirit or consciousness or perception. And so in a sense, it's your karma or the habit energy of your mental states is just habitually creating the same kind of body and the same kind of more or less environment or whatever is required by your karma at the time. So yeah, I guess I would be inclined to more or less agree with this statement by Fred. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. I mean, sometimes people will ask questions that are they're framed in a different way than I usually think. So it kind of catches me kind of off balance, or it's like I'm not really equipped to really like grapple with the question because it's using like a different kind of language, different assumptions or ideas that I generally use. But it was kind of an interesting question. But I'm moving on to the next one. Nevertheless, and this is from Andrew. And Andrew says, this is a question regarding monks and buffets. It is my understanding that they can only eat what is offered to them. But if a monk were to be invited out by a layperson to eat at a buffet, would they be allowed to order and choose what they eat? Or would they only be able to eat what is directly offered to them by the layperson? Just a random thought I had. Thanks. Well, I mean, if you're at a buffet, you don't order. I mean, my understanding of a buffet is you just go down the line. You got like the plate, you got the tray. You just go down and serve yourself. So it wouldn't be like a waiter is taking orders. So I guess this might be some confusion here. But I mean, if there is a waiter taking orders, then there is at least an implicit consent to a monk asking for food. He wouldn't be able to ask for like special food, which would include meat or fish or milk or curd, like delicacies of ancient India, foods that was considered to be like fancy food that rich people eat. Probably he would be forbidden from Winia to ask for that, but he could still ask for rice and curry, that kind of thing. But a buffet where you just go down and help yourself, that would be forbidden. So as a monk, especially when I was staying at a Burmese monastery in California, sometimes a layperson would invite the monks to a buffet. We'd go to, usually it was like a Pakistani restaurant that had goat meat because some of the Burmese monks like goat meat. And so most of the Burmese monks who were not strict at all with regard to following the rules would just go down the line and help themselves. But I was stricter than that. I refused to do that. So there would have to be a Burmese layperson who would serve as my attendant, who would ladle the stuff out onto the plate. I think maybe I could say, yeah, give me some of this or give me some of that, if they gave me permission in advance to do that. So, yeah, that's my understanding of a buffet, is where you serve yourself. So, but I mean, if a monk just sits at a table and orders from the waiter, then there is an implicit assumption that the waiter has given consent to anybody to tell him what he wants. So I don't think that's much of a problem. Although, and I still do this to this day sometimes. It's like when the waiter or the waitress is setting, the server, I should say, is setting the food down. The monk has to touch it before they let go because it has to pass from one hand to the other. If they just set it down on the table without the monk like touching it before it's set down and let go of, it's not offered. So then he might have to just tell the layperson who is attending, that's not offered yet. I can't eat that. And then they'll offer it. But sometimes to this day, if somebody is handing me putting a plate down in front of me or a glass or something, I'll just, through years of habit, just reach out and touch it before they let go of it so that it's properly offered. So I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, do you think there is a relationship between a protruding forehead and insight in the context of the vertical versus slanted direction of the forehead and actual bone protrusions? Well, personally, I don't think like a brow ridge would necessarily have anything to do with like your mental functions. It may be that certain ethnicities are more likely to have a brow ridge, and I mean, I'm going to put it out there that different ethnicities differ from each other, not only physically, which can't be denied except by the most insane leftists, but also psychologically. There are psychological differences at like a statistical level, on average. So it may be that some ethnicity that's more likely to have a protruding brow ridge might have certain different tendencies towards getting certain kinds of insight. But the thing is, Stellar Supreme hasn't really said what insight is. So is there a relationship between a protruding forehead and insight in the context of the vertical versus slanted direction of the forehead and actual bone protrusions? This is sort of like, what is it called? Phrenology. This is sort of like a throwback to phrenology, which Hegel thought phrenology was great. In Hegel's, I mean, this is a total digression here. Bear with me. But Hegel, I mean, I have to agree with Schopenhauer that Hegel was pretty much of a charlatan. That, he had his dialectic. You start off with a thesis, and then you have the antithesis, and then you have the synthesis that combines the thesis and the antithesis, and then that becomes like the next thesis that, again, is just like this never-ending progression until you get into like early 19th century or late 18th century German culture, which was considered like to be the zenith of human development or some such. But it was like Hegel, as the thesis, he had like, it was like physiology, the science of physiology. And then the antithesis was psychology. So it's like everything is physical, and then the antithesis is no, it's mental. And then the glorious synthesis of physiology and psychology was phrenology, where you could determine a person's psychological attributes through like irregularities on their cranium. But let's get back to the actual question here. Do I think there is a relationship between a protruding forehead and insight in the context of the vertical versus slant? Well, I mean, Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, really doesn't say what he means by insight. I mean, does he mean intelligence? Does he mean like wisdom in a more or less Buddhist sense? It could be incidental. I assume there have been super geniuses and enlightened beings, assuming that enlightened beings can exist in some sort of context, that had sloping foreheads or that had like vertical foreheads. What the statistical odds of that would be, I really can't say. So it could be just sort of an incidental thing rather than, it's not going to, certainly, I don't think the slope of your forehead is going to determine your intelligence. It just may have like a statistically significant correlation with intelligence of certain types. Just with regard to like brain shape and so forth, like your frontal lobes, it may be if you've got a vertical forehead versus a really slopey one, that maybe you've got more developed frontal lobes that would allow for at least like intellectual thought, which isn't necessarily the same as wisdom or insight. Wisdom or insight, I mean, you can have people that, I mean, in Burma, like Tom Pulusiano, I don't remember what kind of forehead he had, but he was just like a simple village type who nevertheless had cultivated quite a lot of wisdom. I mean, intelligence and wisdom are not the same. Like intellect and like liberating insight are not the same. So, do I think there is a relationship between a protruding forehead and insight in the context of the vertical versus slanted direction of the forehead? There may be like general statistical correlations or some such, but it wouldn't be you're enslaved to your sloping forehead. I assume that there are people with sloping foreheads that are brilliant, and a lot of people with vertical foreheads that are dunces. So, I mean, there may be very slight statistical correlations or tendencies or whatever, but I'm not exactly sure what they would be. I think in some cases, having a less developed frontal lobe may actually be helpful spiritually, because then you'll be less enslaved to thinking all the time. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this next three questions from Mirror of Emptiness, they seem to be more physics questions than Buddhist questions. For example, first question is, what the hell is light? What is light? And I mean, from the point of view of science, light is a certain bandwidth of electromagnetic radiation that is visible. I mean, I guess some light can be invisible, like ultraviolet light or infrared light. Is it called infrared light, or is it just infrared radiation? But at least it's called ultraviolet light, even though we can't see it. I mean, bees can see it. That a lot of flowers that look white to us are really ultraviolet that the bees can see, but we just see it as white because we can't see that color. So, I mean, technically, from a scientific point of view, light is a certain bandwidth of electromagnetic radiation. And from a more psychological point of view, let's say you don't believe in all the rays and emanations and particles and so forth out there in space, that at the very least, light would be a perception. You are perceiving. I mean, how do you describe light? The opposite of blackness? I mean, if all there is blackness, then blackness wouldn't even mean anything because you wouldn't have anything to compare it with. So I'm not exactly sure how you would explain light psychologically, which is kind of strange. I've never really tried to explain light psychologically. I mean, it would just be like the opposite of darkness. You know, it'd just be the contrasting quality that one contrasts with darkness or blackness or whatever. I guess darkness would be a better opposite for light than blackness, because you can have red light that isn't the opposite of black. So the easiest answer is that it is, a certain visible bandwidth of electromagnetic radiation, plus maybe a little fringes that are visible at least to some beings, but not to humans. So I'll just move on to Mirror of Emptiness' second question, which is, what or where is the source of all light? And going with the psychological explanation, then the source of all light would be perception. With no perception, there would be no awareness of any light. It'd be a subjective experience. But with regard to science, again, like physics, I don't think there is one single source of all light. Anything that can emit a photon would be a source of light. And I do think that there are different possible ways of emitting photons. So, yeah, I think this might be sort of a misconception with regard to the source of all light. I mean, if there was a big bang, you might say that the big bang was the source of all light, even though light, like photons, are being emitted later on, but they couldn't be emitted now if there wasn't like the original beginning. But the Big Bang is now being called into question by numerous scientists and people that do YouTube videos. So I don't think there is just one source of all light, unless it's just perception and karma. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Mirror of Emptiness, which is, without light, would it be eternally night? And I mean, if there was no light, I mean, from the psychological, subjective point of view, I've already touched on this. Like, for example, if you're born blind, you're blind your entire life, then kind of it would be eternally night, except, I mean, you wouldn't really have a concept of it. If, let's say there's some being that just doesn't have eyes, they wouldn't have a concept of darkness, because darkness exists in contrast to lightness. So kind of in a way it would be eternally night, but then they wouldn't even be aware of it any more than a fish is aware of being wet. So, but I mean, getting back to science, without light, I mean, the universe as we know it would not exist, as electromagnetic radiation is one of the 4 great forces known to science. You've got electromagnetic force, right? I think so. You've got gravity, you've got the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force. And I think those are the 4 forces that classical science acknowledges. So, I mean, if there was no light in that sense, if there was no electromagnetic radiation, then, yeah, it wouldn't be, I mean, it might be eternal night simply because the universe just doesn't exist. At least the universe as we know it wouldn't exist. But again, eternally night wouldn't have any meaning without light, because there has to be a contrast. That's what meaning comes from. I mean, you have to have, the thesis and the antithesis, getting back to Hegel, charlatan that he may have been. So, yeah, it all depends on how you look at it, I guess. Different people could answer in different ways, all equally invalidly. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ruhe. And Ruhe says, how tough or strict were your teachers in Burma? Well, the main teacher that I had was, I mean, most people called him Pakoku Sayadaw, although technically his more public name was, let's see, Tongpulu Chaltsin-doya Sayadaw. He wasn't the original Tongpulu Sayadaw. He was like the senior disciple of the original Tongpulu Sayadaw. So he became like the leader of the Tongpulu tradition while he was alive. And he was relatively strict. For example, he followed the Tongpulu tradition of never lying down. He did not lie down until like his final illness, I'm pretty sure. And he followed Vinaya relatively strictly, although he didn't understand it extremely well. Like with regard to intellect, he was about average, maybe slightly above average intelligence-wise. And I mean, with regard to meditation and so forth, that's not necessarily a handicap at all. But with regard to understanding the texts, it does help to be smart. So he had wisdom, but with regard to like school book learning and stuff, he really he had not mastered the texts. And so he broke a lot of the same rules that other monks trying to be strict would break. For example, it's against the rules to handle money. And my teacher, Pakoku Sayadaw, and his Pali name was Usurya, which means Mr. Sun. He didn't touch money, but like a lot of Burmese monks, including like the Sayadaws of the Mahasi tradition, he would still be telling the attendant what to do with money. Go and buy me a couple bags of cement. We got this work project or something, and it's breaking the exact same rule as if the monk was handling the money himself. To tell somebody what to do with money, it's breaking the exact same rule as if you're handling the money yourself. So he was relatively strict. He was tough. I mean, the Tongpulu tradition in which I was ordained was one of the few ascetic forest traditions in Burma. And Tongpulu Doya, Tongpulu Monastery, the original Tongpulu Monastery, and Chaltsin, or Stone Elephant Monastery, which was like 10 miles away. I mean, they were called forest monasteries, but really they were desert monasteries. And I was told by a layperson, the foreign monks who come here, they come here fat and white and they leave brown and thin. And a lot of even Burmese monks, they just couldn't handle it. They just get wiped out by the blazing heat. And it used to be that there was no reservoir. There was no good well at Chaltsin Monastery. So they'd have to walk like 2 miles to the nearest village monastery to take a bath. And of course, they'd be soaking in sweat by the time they walked back again. Although by the time I started living there, they had started making reservoirs where they would dam off gullies so that during the rains retreat, or during the rainy season, the monsoon season, you'd have like little flash floods that would fill up the reservoir with water, and then you'd have water the rest of the year. And then right on the other side of the dam, you'd have a well, which always had water in it. So the roughest times were in the past by the time I lived there, but even then, it was pretty rough. So, yeah, the monks in the Tongpulu tradition, especially the ones living at Chaltsin Doya, which is where I started living when I was in Burma, it was an ascetic place. It was not a comfortable place. I remember one time a Japanese monk spent a rains retreat there, and he asked me how long I'd been there, and I said something like 3 years. And he just gave me this weird look. It says, if you can live here, you can live anywhere. Because it really was fairly ascetic. It was a rough place. But the thing is, with regard to strictness, for better and for worse, I was treated with kid gloves. I was like the rare exotic foreigner. They didn't want to be too rough on me. I wasn't required to go out and whitewash rocks in the blazing sun like the burnt black Burmese monks there. I could just do my own thing. I just stayed in my cave and meditated. Didn't have to come for morning chanting and that kind of thing. I went for alms round by myself. The abbot, Pukoku Sayadaw, was trying to be nice to me by sending me to the least poverty-stricken village. He just said, go to that village every morning. And so I got slightly better quality food there. And I only ate food that I accepted in my bowl at the time. So when they'd go to the really poverty-stricken villages where they'd just be getting like pink chewy rice and some kind of flavorless tomato glop and that kind of thing, when they'd come back, there'd be monastery attendants like right outside the monastery putting better food into their bowl so that they wouldn't all be malnourished. But since I wasn't accepting the food from the monastery, food that was cooked at the monastery or brought by lay people, I was just eating what was put in my bowl in the village. He just had me go to the least poverty-stricken village, which was Lamina village. So they were tough. At least my main teacher, Pukoku Sayadaw, he was a tough guy. He was macho. He was a macho monk and definitely practiced strict austerities, like never lying down. Tongpulu Sayadaw, the original Tongpulu Sayadaw, actually experimented with never even sitting down. He would sleep in a standing position. At least he experimented with it briefly, where he would have like this rope like a clothesline. He would just kind of hang over that and try and sleep that way. They'd go to cemeteries, meditate in cemeteries, that kind of thing. But I was treated like I got special treatment. I didn't ask for it. It was just given to me. Sometimes it was kind of embarrassing, but sometimes it was nice. So, and again, with regard to monastic discipline, my main teacher, Pukoku Sayadaw, he was as strict as he knew how to be, but he didn't fully understand certain rules, and so he kind of didn't follow them perfectly. But he tried, which is way better than most Asian monks are doing. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's next question here. What's your take on mental acts of generosity? And I'm not exactly sure what a mental act of generosity is, unless you're just like fantasizing about being generous. And if you're fantasizing about being generous, Like I do this sometimes. Like you're reading a novel, and then sometimes you're just thinking about, if I was a character in the novel, the way I'd like help people, like in a Charles Dickens novel, I'd be helping people in certain ways, just in these fantasies, just imagining if I was part of the story. And so long as you're imagining doing good deeds, I mean, you are making some good karma. It's just not as, it's more subtle. It doesn't have nearly as much of an effect as if you're actually physically doing the same good deeds. So even thoughts, you're making karma just about everything you think. And when I took ayahuasca the first time, it really struck me just the power of a single thought. That was one of the big insights I had from that first ayahuasca trip, or journey, as they're called. Just the power of a single thought. Most people, they just do not realize how powerful just a single thought is. So if you're thinking about doing good things, it may not be as powerful of karma as actually physically doing good things, but still it's better than just fantasizing about doing bad things or thinking about doing bad things. But I'm not even 100% sure if this is what Ruhe is referring to with regard to mental acts of generosity. I'm not sure how you can, sending metta might be a kind of a mental act of generosity, but that's good karma too. So it's certainly better than mental acts of stinginess, that you are making karma with your thoughts. And so thinking good thoughts is going to make good karma, and thinking bad thoughts is going to make bad karma, using the vulgar terminology of good and bad. But aside from that, I'm not exactly sure what Ruhe is referring to, if he's not referring to just like imagining doing good deeds or just having good intentions towards somebody. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Esoteric Boy. And Esoteric Boy, possibly in sheer exasperation, asks the question, what's that guy's name? Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana? What does that even look like in writing? And I forgot to write it down. I was going to write that down. Maybe I should do that down. Let's do S-Y... I said it wrong. This very second letter, Siyovaxsh. I think, this is how I spell it. It may not be how Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana spells his own name. Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana. And really, I guess you can't look in the YouTube comments anymore because Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana was kicked off of YouTube. He got his channel canceled, and so he had to join the Discord server in order to continue asking questions. But this is how I spell his name, I think. Here, let me just scroll up, make sure that I really do spell it this way. Please bear with me here. Okay, yeah. All right, now I scroll back down to Esoteric Boy. Okay, so this is how I spell it. There may be slight variations with how he spells it, but there you go. Looky there. There it is. And these are two different names. Siyovaxsh is he was like a satrap in ancient Persia that had this legend about him. He was some kind of martyr in ancient Persia. And the En-sipad-zid-ana, I think, might be on like the Sumerian king list or something. That he was earlier than Persia. He was some kind of Mesopotamian, possibly legendary figure. And I have no idea why Siyovaxsh En-sipad-zid-ana has chosen to go by this name, assuming that his parents didn't just name him that. Unless it just sounds cool, though. It is kind of a cool sounding name. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from the Proto-Pseudo-Monk. And the Proto-Pseudo-Monk often includes little titles or headings to his questions, and that the heading to this one is meditation and sleep. And the question is, why does meditation make you sleep less? And what is the mind-brain connection explanation? Well, I mentioned that the only time I've been able to get by on 4 hours or less of sleep, or even less than 5 hours of sleep on average, is when my meditation is going really well. And in that Q&A, I think it might be just the previous one to this one, I gave two theories. I'm not 100% sure, but when you're meditating, it's like your body's in a state of rest. You're in a state of ease. You're not acquiring lots of information that requires processing. And that's one of the reasons why we sleep, especially dreaming, is to process the information, to strengthen neural pathways and organize and just sort of digest the information of the day. So we've got, when we're meditating a lot, we're not thinking very much. So there's less of that requires us to dream in order to process it. Plus we're just in a state of ease, maybe a state of heightened awareness that just makes us less sleepy. And to some degree, it could physiologically compensate for sleep. It may have a lot of the same benefits as a sound sleep, even though if you're meditating well, you're more awake than you are usually in your ordinary life. So again, like last time I mentioned this, I'm not 100% sure why it is that good intensive meditation, when it's going well, causes you to need less sleep. But it does. Whatever the reason is, it is true that if you're doing intensive meditation and your meditation is going well, you're getting into relatively subtle meditative states, you don't need to sleep nearly as much. So, it's either the meditation itself has some of the same effects as sleep, or it's just because you're meditating, you're not doing the sort of thing that requires you to sleep more, and possibly a combination of the two. So I'm just going to move on to Proto-Pseudo-Monk's next question, and the heading is Monk's IQ. And the question is, what is a monk's average IQ and why? And that would depend on the ethnicity of the monk, I think. Because if you're born into a Buddhist culture, like in Burma or Thailand, then there's going to be more of a range of IQs. You're going to have down to the bottom limit of just being intelligent enough to be a monk. That some people in Burma, they're like a Koyenji or like a Samanera, like an adult Samanera, like a novice their entire life, just because the abbot of the monastery thinks that they're just not competent enough mentally to be able to learn the Vinaya rules, for example. So, but that's rare among Western monks, because a Western monk, first of all, Buddhism is kind of an intellectual, spiritual system. And especially in the West, when you're not just born into it, you convert. It's often for intellectual reasons. It's just the philosophy is intellectually satisfying. So the average Western monk, or a monk from a non-Buddhist culture, is probably above average in IQ. Whereas in Burma, it might be close to the average, maybe slightly above average, but it'd be more inflated for Buddhist monks from a non-Buddhist culture, because mainly they have to be more or less intellectual just to study Buddhism, to deviate from their cultural traditions. They have the strength of mind to essentially defy their own cultural traditions, possibly defy their own family's wishes and so forth, to break with their friends. And because they are so intrigued and filled with faith, I guess, or confidence in this system that is very intellectual, very head-oriented. Theravada Buddhism, especially before it came to the West and got feminized, was possibly the most masculine spiritual tradition in existence, more so than Islam, just because it was developed by ascetic men that were tough ascetics. You know, I mean, they were just kind of macho men, even though they were living a spiritual life of celibacy and so forth. You know, they were tough and they avoided women like the plague. So it was like a tough intellectual men developing this system for tough intellectual men. And so, like Western men who are intellectual and have a certain liking for asceticism, austerity, are more drawn to becoming a monk. And so, I don't know what the average IQ for a for a monk who is not born into a Buddhist tradition, but might be something like 115, maybe even 120. I mean, there are some relatively dumb Western monks too, and just monks not born into Western traditions. But in Burma, the average IQ for a monk might be around 100, I would guess. So, I mean, that's just wild guesses, just based on my experience with Western monks and with Asian monks. But of course, I never did any cognitive testing of any of these people. So I'm just going to move on to the next question from the proto-pseudo-monk, which is entitled The Fruition of Mahayana's Goal Through Transhumanism and Superintelligence. So, the proto-pseudo-monk says, please refute the following claim. I believe that a possible way of all beings becoming enlightened is through merging with a superintelligence. If all matter in the entire universe was used to create a supercomputer and all minds somehow became a part of this, we could experience the infinite block of stone, giving form to the infinite formlessness through simulation using quantum computers. Maybe we are in this now, therefore exhaust the endless rounds of samsara, then upon completion of the simulation, such a being or beings may understand the Four Noble Truths, transcend samsara, and enter Nibbana, and leave the block of stone. I know you aren't a materialist, but mathematics and physics give us more and more precise models of reality that results in advanced technology. I see a possibility of maybe understanding the law of karma, laws of physics, law of mind, maybe directing all mind streams to points where they achieve enlightenment by manipulating these laws or by creating advanced technology through understanding of these laws. Given the trend of exponential growth, who knows where we end up? I intuit you have some Western philosophy to refute this. Please do so if you do. This belief became strong after various psychedelic trips, shrooms and LSD, of becoming one with the cosmic mind, trying to solve all suffering. So I regard it as delusional fantasy, but I strongly believe it. However, the undharmic approach to this dharmic goal, enlightenment of all beings, is that we would have to be bodhisattvas, postponing enlightenment, pursuing research in STEM, aka worldly knowledge, which is a paradox. The contemplatives would answer this question by not clinging to thinking, effectively not answering it, but as a thinking addict, it must come through thinking and reason. If I follow a scholarly path like yours, may I find the answer, or is it by first principles unanswerable and one of faith in materialism and its false premises and promises? Also a request, I think you and Stevens should continue your conversation on transhumanism. Would love to hear more. Okay, that's sort of like a separate little addendum there. Okay, first of all, I would just say that you can't leave the block of stone. That my theory of everything, my toe, if you will, is essentially like the analogy, the simile is a block of stone. And that block of stone may as well be formless. It's on a barren plain, nothing to compare it with. So let's just say it's an effectively sizeless block of stone. And within that block of stone is every possible statue that could ever possibly exist, including a lot of statues that couldn't possibly exist. It's all in there. Every single molecule of every statue is already there in the right place. You just got to remove the excess stone. But it's every possible statue is already in that stone. And if one of those virtual, imaginary, potential statues were to become enlightened, it's not going to change anything with regard to that block of stone. I mean, it's not going to be that there's every possible statue except one now in that stone. It's all going to be there always, and there's nothing you can do about that. So that's one little quibble with regard to entering Nibbana, is that, I mean, the block of stone remains the same. That all the statues are going to be there, including the statue of you being a miserable wretch. Not that I'm claiming that you, dear viewer, are a miserable wretch, but any miserable wretch who then becomes enlightened, let's say Angulimala, the mass murderer, he becomes enlightened. The statue of Angulimala, the mass murderer killing people, is still in that block of stone. Nothing could possibly erase that. It's just transcending the illusion that these statues are real instead of just potential or virtual. And we are living in a virtual reality, but it's not, in my opinion, generated by a computer. It's just generated by this infinite energy or consciousness, whatever you want to say, that has just every possibility contained within it because it's infinite. So I think the main question here is getting like a super omniscient computer and having that. Let's see, are all the beings going to be like uploaded into this computer? Or is it the computer is going to become enlightened and then just somehow enlighten everybody else? But that couldn't happen because you'd have to have the karma for that. I mean, you have to have the karma to even be exposed to an omniscient computer. Might as well digress a little bit in that one of my favorite science fiction authors since I was in college is Brian Ruhe. And one of his favorite themes is, in the future, there will be religions based on omniscient computers. You know, you just get this computer that's complex enough, you turn it on, and within, like a split second of turning it on, it just becomes enlightened, essentially. It becomes omniscient. And then, it could be a small computer. You put it on your altar and you go and bow before it and, dust it off and ask it questions, and it gives you advice about how best to live your life. Also, it reminds me of a different science fiction author that I read. I think it was in high school. There was a story by Larry Niven called The Schumann Computer. And there's this guy named Rick Schumann who owns the Draco Tavern. It's at a space station orbiting Earth, I think. And there's one of the most powerful alien races in this part of the galaxy are called the Chirpsithra. And they're a very ancient race. They've been around for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And Rick Schumann, he's got sparking devices in his bar just to attract these Chirpsithra, because the Chirpsithra, they get drunk on not alcohol, they get drunk on electricity. They stroke their fingers on these sparking devices, and it gives them little shocks that then get them drunk somehow. So anyways, he's learned a little bit of their language, and he's always listening because these Chirpsithra are so far technically advanced above us. We're like Papua New Guinea to them, that he thinks that he's going to get rich if he just picks up the right nugget of information. And so there's like this drunk Chirpsithra there talking about how thousands of years ago, the Chirpsithra developed an omniscient computer. But nothing really came of it. But Rick Schumann, his eyes light up, it's like dollar signs. It's like, could you give me information on that omniscient computer? And so the Chirpsithra says, next time I pass through here, I'll bring you the blueprint for it and like the instructions on how to make the thing. But like I say, it didn't amount to much. So sometime later, the Chirpsithra has sobered up and comes back with the instructions on making this omniscient computer. And so Rick Schumann, he starts building this thing, and he's got to like borrow a lot of money in order to build this. And he turns it on, and within a relatively short time, the computer just starts asking for, it needs access to the Library of Congress, and it needs like a remote control rover on the surface of the moon. It's asking for this stuff. It can't become omniscient until it gets like this critical mass of information. And the computer learns within a relatively short time. If it uses like a sexy female voice, it's more likely to get what it wants. And so Rick Schumann's going deeper and deeper in debt, providing it with, the remote controlled lunar rover and all this stuff, access to the space telescopes and stuff. And so he's getting deeper and deeper in debt, but he consoles himself by thinking, once this thing becomes omniscient, I'll be able to, predict, I'll be able to like make a killing on the stock market. I'll know what horses are going to win the Kentucky Derby, all this kind of stuff. And finally, the computer tells him it's right at the verge. It just needs a little bit more information. And then finally, when it gets that information, it just self-destructs. It just turns itself off in such a way that it can't be turned on again. It just kind of makes itself melt down. And somehow, once you become omniscient, according to the story, then you realize you're better off dead. So that's what happens. You get an omniscient computer, it just immediately shuts down. And who knows? That could really happen in this scenario of the super intelligent computer somehow causing us all to become enlightened. But we'd have to have the karma for that in order to become enlightened, which most of us don't have. Most of us don't even want to become enlightened. So one other little thing I would mention to this essay question here is what Immanuel Kant said, that no amount of intellect is going to get you 1 micron closer to the thing in itself. That you cannot approach reality through thought or ideas or data. That you can have a more elaborate, self-consistent, intellectual virtual universe, but you're never going to get any closer at all to the thing in itself. You're stuck completely at a level of the thing as it seems. So it's not like a lot of scientists consider science to just be like this intellectual Tower of Babel that's going to just reach itself up into the heavens of omniscience someday. But it's just never going to reach it. It can't. Because you do not become enlightened through figuring out reality. To some degree, the best use for intellect is as a kind of bullshit detector. And just eventually you get to the point of like Nagarjuna's Mula Majamaka Karaka, where you just use ruthless logic to attack any idea until you've destroyed all possible ideas except the philosophy itself, and then it just turns on that and destroys that, just leaving this clarity, emptiness behind. So I don't think it matters how intelligent a computer gets. It's really not going to become enlightened. And so it can't really help. It might be able to help us become enlightened, but it's not going to cause us to become enlightened. And I don't think that there really is any cause for enlightenment, which is paradoxical. That's heresy from a Theravadan point of view, although once you get to the level of Mahayana with increased subtlety, philosophical subtlety, then there are a lot of Mahayana texts that will emphasize the fact that there really is no cause for enlightenment and nothing really is gained at the moment of enlightenment. The block of stone remains exactly the same. So let's see. I'm not exactly sure how the computer, and all mine somehow became a part of this. Okay, so according to the proto-pseudo-monk, we'd somehow all have to be uploaded into this computer. And I really don't think, just like going with Immanuel Kant, that, no amount of intellection, no amount of information is going to get you enlightened. No amount of perception is going to cause you to understand what is beyond perception. So I guess I answered that question, sort of, maybe, a little bit. And I'll just get to this last little addendum here. Also, as a request, I think you and Stevens should continue your conversation on transhumanism. Would love to hear more. Actually, Stevens and I have communicated a bit over the past weeks. with regard to what to do our next talk about, and it may be something about like suffering and addiction. So transhumanism, I had a friend at work. I told him I had a YouTube channel. So I just come out with the talk about transhumanism with Stevens. So that's the video that he watched. He said he started watching it and it was too creepy. He was filled with existential dread and had to stop watching the video. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Mafilez, like M-A and then F-I-L-E-S-Z. I don't know how to pronounce that. But anyways, MF says, have you ever read Piyadasi Bhikkhu's Vimutti Dhamma from chakra to Dhamma chakra? Looks like tantric Theravada relating the jhanas to the chakras. What do you think of it? Is it possible to combine such different approaches? Thank you. Well, I'm not exactly sure who Piyadasi Bhikkhu is, but Brian Ruhe did an interview with an older Western monk who I think had been a disciple of Bhante Gunaratana. And he really was into like Hindu yoga and the chakra idea, the system of the 7 chakras. And it might be that this is the same monk. I'm not sure. But he's the only monk I know of who has incorporated the Hindu concept of chakras into Theravada Buddhism. And you really can incorporate other things into Theravada Buddhism. I mean, in the West, we've got Western psychology and a certain amount of science that has been incorporated into Theravada Buddhism. Just about any culture is going to incorporate certain elements of its own indigenous culture into Theravada. Like in Burma, you've got, the belief in the Nat cult and so forth. And in Thailand also, they've got their small g gods that have just sort of been incorporated into Theravada. So, I mean, it does happen that you can incorporate different traditions into Theravada. There's a certain amount of syncretism that's almost inevitable. Maybe it's totally inevitable when a system enters a different culture. So, I mean, it is possible. I don't know to what extent the chakra system really is like compatible with Theravada. I mean, it's not like blatantly incompatible, but I mean, there's nothing that I have read in the Theravada texts, and I've read most of them, that really supports the chakra idea. The Buddha had like the little third eye mark, this little hairy spot on his forehead, that kind of thing. But that's not very firm, solid evidence in support of the 6th chakra of the third eye, or just the entire system in general. And I think I need to drink an energy drink here. Let's see here. No, still less than 2 hours. Golly, we're just getting started. Just kidding. So let's see here. Yeah, Piyadasi Bhikkhu. I don't know if that's the Western or the American monk that Brian Ruhe interviewed that does include the chakra system into Theravada, that he finds it valuable. Probably his disciples and students find it valuable. Otherwise, they would find a different teacher, I guess. He relates the jhanas to the chakras. So I'm not exactly sure how. I assume if you relate the jhanas to the chakras, then you'd have to get to a certain level in order for, once you get to the heart chakra, that might be first jhana or something. And then the opening of like let's see, 5th chakra. What's the throat chakra, I guess? That might be 2nd jhana. And see, the third eye would be 3rd jhana, I guess. And then like the crown of the lotus would be 4th jhana. Yeah, you can do that. I mean, you can combine just different systems together that weren't designed to go together at first, or even like Abhidhamma, for example, which is the 3rd Pitaka of the Tipitaka in Buddhism, is pretty much ignored by all of the schools today except for Theravada. And in some countries like Thailand, they don't pay much attention to it anyway. Burma, it's considered to be extremely important. But I mean, it's teaching something other than what the suttas teach. You know, it's reinterpreting a lot of stuff. And so this can do the same thing, whether it would be positive or negative. I assume for some people it would make things better, maybe make things a little easier to understand in certain ways, give them a firmer grasp of something. And for other people, it might just be useless or worse than useless. But I guess the main question, well, let's see, there's a bunch of question marks here. The first question, have you ever read Piyadasi Bhikkhu's Vimutti Dhamma from Chakra to Dhamma Chakra? The answer is no. And then let's see, what do you think of it? Which would be the Tantric Theravada relating the jhanas to the chakras. Yeah, that's pretty much what I've been rambling and meandering about for the past 5 minutes, I guess. Is it possible to combine such different approaches? Yeah, it is possible. To what extent it's going to be an improvement, or to what extent it's going to be, detrimental, I really can't say. Depending on the wisdom of the person who comes up with the system, I think. So I guess I answered that question. I mean, mainly it's about a book that I haven't read and a monk that I'm not sure if I know who it is. But just in general, you can combine two different systems into a larger system, or at least elements of two different systems into a larger system. Just like modern medicine has adopted a lot of Theravada Buddhist meditation techniques, especially just mindfulness or satipatthana, something like that. I mean, that's in a way it detracts from Dhamma because it's not being used for the purpose of enlightenment. It's just being used for the purpose of a kind of psychological or physical therapy. But still, I mean, it can be done. And the wisdom of it and the benefit of it will depend on the wisdom of the person who is developing the system, I think. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Elias. And Elias says, do you think that your strict adherence to the Vinaya rules has subconsciously filled you with pride as you have set yourself apart from the lukewarm massive monks? If yes, would that generate unwholesome karma? I think that I would certainly feel proud if I'm one of few who takes the rules seriously. Well, I mean, I'm not filled with pride over my strictness in Vinaya now because I don't follow Vinaya anymore. At the time, I don't know if pride was really the right word for it. To some degree, sometimes there'd be a kind of self-righteousness or a kind of, I think the worst thing about it was just contempt of monks that were just sloppy monks. And I think one of the most classic examples of that that comes to mind, one time I was, as a monk, just walking barefoot in my robes down the sidewalk in Rangoon. And I remember there was a monk walking in front of me. Monk I didn't know. He was just, 30 feet in front of me. And there was a pretty girl waiting at a bus stop. And that Burmese monk that was in front of me obviously swerved out of his way to grab her ass. And she just turned around like in surprise, saw that it was a monk, and then just pretend like nothing happened. And I just wanted to just go up and just tap him on the shoulder and just punch him in the face. I really did. I mean, that was just so out of line. But there are a lot of times, like I remember one time I was at Chanmyet Yeta, which is affiliated with the Mahasi tradition in Rangoon. And I was standing there talking to a friend of mine who was also a monk. And this other monk, who was a visitor monk, came up and was saying, where do I donate money if I want to donate a meal for the monks? And then the friend that I was talking to just said, go to the office, talk about it there. And I remember as he walked away, I was talking to the friend of mine, and it's like, sometimes I just want to just go smack, smack, smack to monks like that. It's like, I mean, he's not only breaking the rules, but he's going to be causing all the monks at that monastery who don't go for alms round to break the rules by eating food that was paid for by a monk. And so, I mean, I had a certain amount of contempt, really. Contemptuousness. Atimana, I think it's called in Pali. More than mana. See, mana is like conceit or pride. Atimana is like contempt for others. And they usually come together. They sound similar, mana and atimana. Although they're not extremely closely related. They're related words, but anyways. So yeah, I mean, that does generate unwholesome karma. Wanting to punch a monk in the face is unwholesome karma. Just wanting to slap one up a little bit. Maybe shake him violently by the shoulders for several seconds. Yeah, I mean, certainly that's negative karma. That's unwholesome karma on my part. As a general rule, I just avoided Burmese monks as much as possible when I was in Burma. There was a famous monk, an Italian monk, who lived in Burma during British times, like during the 1930s and 40s. And he just avoided monasteries. And it's pretty much true that it is impossible. It's impossible not to break a rule, even just setting foot on most Theravada Buddhist monasteries. That the only way to avoid breaking rules is to avoid other monks and to avoid monasteries. Like, it's against the rules to make use of anything that has been paid for by monk's money, you know, like eating the meal that silly monk wanted to donate to the monastery. That technically speaking, I think it's just in the commentaries, but still it's Orthodox tradition that if you use anything that has been paid for with a monk's money, then you're breaking a rule. And almost any monastery has had monks donating to that monastery. You know, they're helping to pay the bills. They're donating for some new building, or even they're just asking for donations, which is just as bad as if they're using their own money. And so, just setting foot on the property on most of these places, you're already breaking a rule. I mean, and that whole thing would just had me kind of depressed and disgusted a lot of the time, disillusioned. And I mean, it wasn't entirely negative, but there was a lot of negativity involved in it. Just realizing that most Buddhist monks really don't want Nibbana. They're not striving for enlightenment. You know, they just want to live an easy life or whatever. Mostly the Asian ones. There's quite a few Western monks that are like that too, but Western monks tend to be stricter on average than Asian monks or monks from Buddhist cultures, simply because they're making more of a sacrifice. You know, they're not just going along with the flow. They're not conforming to their culture. They're going against their culture. And so they have like stronger feelings about what they're doing. They want to be a good monk as a general rule. So I think I've just sort of wandered away, ranted away from the question here. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know if it really filled me with pride, because I knew at the time that, you know, I had other shortcomings that, you know, including, I mean, you know that pride is not good. So it kind of helps you not to be proud. But still, when you see monks that are just flouting the rules and just flouting Dhamma, it just causes you just disgust and just maybe sometimes wanting to punch somebody. And of course, that would generate some unwholesome karma. So I guess I should just move on to Elias's next question here, which is, I think there are personality types that are attracted to fixed rules like the Vinaya or also the Mosaic law. Do you have such a personality? Well, that's like anal retentive or something, or maybe a little bit of obsessive compulsive. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think I was nearly that way. To some degree, I mean, there's always going to be like a scale. There's shades of gray. So I'm sure there are certain elements of that in me. But I mean, to begin with, when I first became a monk, I really wasn't that concerned about following the rules strictly until I realized that, I mean, these are the rules, and I'm voluntarily joining this order. Nobody forced me to become a monk, and you might as well follow the rules, because if you don't follow the rules, you are cheating. And I just it was sort of like, just in good conscience, just in good faith, just trying to follow the rules. And it turns out that the only way not to break Vinaya rules is to be pretty much of an expert on Vinaya, because it's like 4 thick volumes of rules. It's like this thick of pages containing all these rules. And so you got to study up and be pretty much of an authority on the subject. Otherwise, you're going to be breaking rules without even realizing you're breaking rules. And another thing, when I was a junior monk, there's like the trinity of sila, samadhi, and panya, morality, concentration, and wisdom. And my concentration and wisdom were beyond me at the time. They weren't good enough to satisfy me. But at least the morality part of the following rules, that I could do. That was like the only part of being a monk that I could really do well, was, study up on the rules, just don't break the rules. So that was largely my motivation for becoming like this extremely strict monk, at least with regard to following the rules of monastic discipline. But I think what you're touching upon here, what Elias here is touching upon, is what in Buddhism is called Silabbata Paramasa, which is adherence to morality and observances. And the observances, the morality would include rules that have a moral basis. The observances would include the rules that really don't have a moral basis, just like only eating in the morning. There's nothing immoral about eating at night, or eating in the afternoon, or wearing the right kind of robes, or shaving your head periodically. There's nothing immoral about having long hair, for example. But when you start like clinging to that and thinking that, you're going to go to hell or something if you don't like follow every rule, then I never really took it that far. And there's probably some elements of Silabbata Paramasa that I had with regard to such things, but I never really took it that far. And eventually there were certain rules that I did start breaking just because they were such dumb rules. And I've talked about this sort of thing before. There's only one rule that I broke from the beginning, and that was, it's against the rules for a monk to look into a mirror unless he has some kind of sore on his face that he's investigating. And shaving without using a mirror was such a pain in the neck that, I would look into a mirror to shave. And usually I'd nick myself before very long, so at least I'd have the sore that I could investigate. But there's a book, the Vinaya Mukha, by Venerable Vajiranyana Rasa, who was he was the Sangha Raja of Thailand like 100 or more years ago, and literally the son of King Mongkut. So he was definitely a royal prince. And he said in one of his Vinaya books that it's justifiable. You can look in a mirror when you shave, and that was good enough for me. So with his authority, which he didn't really have, nobody has the authority to change the rules, not even the Thai Sangha Raja. That he said it was okay, so I said, all right, I'll look into a mirror when I shave. So, I don't really have like the kind of personality that clings to rules so much as just, I wanted to be honest and be a monk in good faith by not cheating, by breaking rules. And it was a good practice. There were times when I wished that there were more rules just so that it would make me behave better. It kind of helped to keep me under control a little bit, having all these rules to follow. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is also from Elias. And Elias says, isn't it contradictory that the ultimate goal of the Dhamma is to let go while there is a strict monastic code like the Vinaya? And I mentioned earlier, not today, but in a previous Q&A, that there is a scene, I think it's in Vinaya, where a monk is asking the Buddha, why is it that previous Buddhas, their dispensation did not last very long? And the Buddha said, it's because they didn't have Vinaya rules. And in the early texts, like the Atthakavagga, it really does warn against like adhering to rules. But without rules, Buddhism would just fall apart. I mean, you got to have some kind of structure that, it keeps everybody sort of uniform and just, following along in a more or less correct direction to some degree. And so I guess it was like a necessary evil. Like, I am skeptical that the Buddha himself came up with Vinaya. There were certain traditions in ancient India that all the ascetics pretty much followed, like eating only in the morning and not handling money and being celibate and this kind of thing, not telling lies, that kind of thing. But, in the early texts like the Atthakavagga, it does warn against adhering to rules. And also, you can read between the lines, like the official history of the first great council after the Buddha died was caused by, according to tradition, according to the text itself, there was an old monk. Most of the monks were, if they were enlightened, they had equanimity. Those that weren't enlightened yet were grieving because the Buddha had just died. But then you've got this old monk who was ordained when he was old. It was Do Tuet in Burmese. He was just saying, why is everybody so upset? Now we can do whatever we want. We don't have Venerable Gautama saying, do this, don't do that all the time. We can do whatever we want to. And Maha Kassapa, who was senior monk in the Sangha after the Buddha died, was mildly alarmed at this and decided, well, we better formulate some kind of monastic discipline just to keep bozos like this guy from just running Buddhism into the ground within the first 20 years of its existence, or first 100 years of its existence, let's say. So Vinaya rules, in a way, they're pretty much necessary just to establish, to stabilize the Sangha, really. And some of Vinaya is just ordination procedures and so forth that they're pretty much necessary, really. Although it may be that the rules are kind of excessive. I do not think that all Vinaya rules originated with the Buddha. So I do think that you had like certain monks that just, they're like certain teachers are just coming up with these rules, and just more and more of them. Sort of like, what is it in Judaism? You got the Mosaic Law, and then you got, what is it? The Talmud or something, where, they just sort of multiply the rules into something just wild. Like there's a commandment in the Old Testament: "Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk." And it was like one of the few attempts of the Old Testament to have humanity towards animals. To have humane treatment towards animals. You don't boil a baby animal in its own mother's milk. It's just kind of sacrilegious towards motherhood and so forth. And then later scholars turn that into a rule saying you can't eat meat and dairy products in the same meal, which is just kind of silly. It's just based on a misinterpretation of this other rule. So I've pretty much digressed way the hell away from this question, I think. Isn't it contradictory that the ultimate goal of the Dhamma is to let go while there is a strict monastic code like the Vinaya? Well, the thing with Vinaya, after you've been following it for a couple years, you just stop thinking about it. It just becomes second nature. It's like you no longer have to obsess over it or anything. It just becomes just the habitual way that you go about things. When you go to the outhouse, you do it according to Vinaya, and you've done it according to Vinaya for so long that you don't even think about it. You're not stressing out or worrying about breaking rules so much as, it's the way you've been doing it for years, and it's just how you do it. So it's really not that bad. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, I know that acting out of revenge is bad. How does that work with meting out justice? Well, that is a good question. And the thing is, I mean, you can mete out justice without anger and hatred and vengeance. Because that's the bad part. I mean, obviously, if you're going to be meting out justice by decapitating somebody, then yeah, I mean, the executioner is going to be making some bad karma. Probably the person who has sentenced the criminal to death is going to make some bad karma. Like the jeering crowd is going to be making some bad karma if it is a public execution, as executions were up until relatively recently. But still, it's worse karma if you do it out of anger and hatred. So, I mean, this reminds me of the story of the samurai. I've told this story more than once. It is a nice story, though, so I might as well digress a bit and tell the story again about there's this samurai, this young samurai, and his master was one of the greatest swordsmen in Japan. And so because he was one of the greatest swordsmen in Japan, people are always challenging him to duels, because whoever can beat this guy is going to make a name for himself. You know, he's the one that defeated the great master. So anyways, eventually this samurai's master gets killed in a duel. So it's this samurai's duty to avenge his master. So he seeks out the guy who killed him, the other samurai who killed his master, and challenges him to a duel. And they're fighting with swords, as the samurai did, as a general rule. And this young samurai has the enemy down on the ground. He's about ready to finish him off. And then the other samurai who's lying on his back just spits up into his face in defiance. He just spits in the guy's face. And all of a sudden, this samurai, he's just filled with rage. That's a deadly insult. You don't spit in a samurai's face, and he's going to really kill him down. And then he realizes he's no longer motivated by honor or duty. He's just motivated by anger and rage and hatred. So the only thing for him to do is he just stands up, sheathes his sword, and walks away. He doesn't kill the guy because he wouldn't have killed him honorably. And so that's sort of like the similar principle to meting out justice, to the extent that it has to be meted out sometimes. If you want to be a saint, you may just avoid the job of meting out justice to wrongdoers. But still, in any kind of functioning society, criminals need to be punished in order to deter crime in future and also to get criminals off the street. So you just have to do it as a matter of duty for the good of society. That would be like your main motivation. You might still be making some bad karma, but at least you're not like, it's not like a criminal's being lynched by a howling mob. It's just done because it has to be done. It's just the duty of the person doing it. They just do their duty. And it's not as bad as if they're just motivated by feelings of revenge and hatred and anger and so forth. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is the very last question. And this is from the Ottoman. Not the footstool, but the Turk. And the Ottoman says, was Buddha a Scythian prince with dark blue eyes? And that is a common theory nowadays. With regard to, it has two parts here. Was the Buddha a Scythian prince? And did the Buddha have dark blue eyes? So I guess we can divide that up into two sub-questions. With regard to him being a Scythian prince, for a long time, whether he was a prince or not is kind of unlikely, because according to historians of ancient India, the city-state of Kapilavatthu was like an oligarchic republic. It was ruled by a council of elders. There really wasn't a king or a king's son who was a prince. So that might be kind of a mistake. But was the Buddha a Scythian? It is true that he belonged to the Sakya clan or the Shakya clan. And it may be that etymologically, Sakya is related to Scythia, or also the Sakas, who were a kind of more or less Scythian ethnicity that lived north of ancient Persia, who invaded in northwestern India after the Greeks did. They kind of overthrew the Greek kingdoms, and then you have the Saka kingdoms in northwestern India. And it may be that there is an etymological connection between Shakya, Scythia, and Saka. So it may be that the Buddha had a certain amount of like Iranian, Persian kind of ancestry, although I don't think that he was planted there by any Persian king, as is like a relatively well-known theory nowadays. That I would guess that, considering that he probably was born and raised in what is now Nepal, like in northeastern India, quite a ways from Persia anyway, that it may be that there was just a wave of these Proto-Scythians that settled in India, possibly even before Vedic times. And, they were just doing their own thing. And then the Indo-Aryans came in, and just over the centuries of, interbreeding with the indigenous people and with the Vedic Indo-Aryans, and, just acculturation, just gradually they became more Indianized. That it may be that he was kind of Scythian in the sense that a lot of Americans are like, fifth, sixth generation Italians or Irish or something. They can say that they're Italian, but really they've been living in America. Their great grandparents may have come to America, and they've been living there for quite a while. You might not be able to speak any Italian other than ciao and like spaghetti and stuff. So it is possible that the Buddha had some like Scythian or Proto-Scythian ancestry, although he probably had quite a lot of Indo-Aryan ancestry too, after just interbreeding and so forth, just blending together, the melting pot. I am rather skeptical that he was born outside of India and was just stationed there by the demand of some Persian king trying to use like Buddhist Dharma as a way of converting Indian people into becoming willing vassals of Persia, which is a relatively well-known theory nowadays. But I do think it is possible that he may have had some Scythian ancestry. And with regard to the dark blue eyes, it's impossible to really know what color the Buddha's eyes were. According to tradition, the color of his eyes were abhi-nila. And nila usually means blue. Abhi means something like very or especially. So it could be that the Buddha did have intensely blue eyes. That is the tradition, but that is one of the 32 marks of a great man. And the 32 marks of a great man are apparently a later addition to Buddhist tradition. So, it's not really authoritative. It's not like, like firsthand people that knew the Buddha were saying, yeah, he had intensely blue eyes. It was more of a legend. And some of those 32 marks of the great man, they're just impossible. There's no way that any human being could have all 32 of those marks. And if he had most of them, he would look like some kind of monster. He would not look human. So the 32 marks of the great man, which includes the eyes that are abhi-nila or intensely blue, or sometimes nila can mean like blue-black. Although as an eye color, you can have blue-black hair, but I think as an eye color, black eyes are really just very dark brown. So it would be like brown-black instead of blue-black. So with regard to the Buddha being a Scythian prince with dark blue eyes, nobody can really say. Nobody knows for sure. People have theories and hypotheses with regard to the Buddha's eye color or the Buddha's ethnicity and so forth. There is some evidence that the Buddha did come from more or less of a Scythian background, but I'm guessing that his family was living in like around Kapilavatthu or in India at least for several generations. That he was pretty much Indian at that point, more than Scythian, that were like a nomadic tribes people living in Central Asia that spoke an Iranian language. So, I mean, the correct answer to that is nobody really knows. That you can just show some evidence one way or the other. You can point out tradition that may or may not be reliable. But I do and have thought for quite a while that the Buddha may have had Scythian ancestry or like proto-Scythian ancestry. But I never thought that he was like an immigrant himself into India from the steppes of Central Asia, or that he was stationed there by a Persian king for the sake of subverting Vedic culture. So that's it. I guess I'm done answering that question. So I'm done answering all of them their questions. And so if you have any questions you think maybe I can answer, feel free to put them in the comments below. And if you haven't hit the like button yet, you might want to consider hitting the like button. I mean, you lasted this long, didn't you? Unless you just hate watching, in which case you don't hit the like button then. And subscribe if you please, and look at my links in the URL links, which YouTube has magnanimously allowed me to start posting again after several months of punishment. And that would include also my book, Essays in Theravada Buddhism, that I have mentioned a couple times, like with regard to the ancient Indian star calendar and the way monks traditionally make confession. And with all that said, then all I got left to say is be happy.